All right. Well, welcome to the Cod and Coca report. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Saurabh Jha on to discuss something of great interest. Dr. Jha, is well known to almost everyone, but to the one or two people who have not heard of the famous Dr. Jha. He's a radiologist currently at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He got his undergrad in the University of London, graduating in the 1960s, right, Dr. Jha?
Yeah, plus or minus 30 years.
went on to go to medical school in the University of London, and subsequently started a general surgery training in London as well. Also was found himself in Australia doing surgical training until he finally found his true calling, which was apparently radiology. He did a fellowship here at the University of Penn and has stayed on ever since. He's an incredibly prolific writer and a brilliant essayist, and writes for the healthcareblog.com.
His main calling and his main feat is to channel both at the same time Christopher Hitchens and G.K. Chesterton.
Yes.
Which is remarkable.
It is. The medical, I don't think a medical version of that has not existed, so it's impressive. So he's specifically here today to talk about the case of Hadiza Bawa-Garba, who's a pediatric trainee in the NHS. She was involved in a tragic case of a young boy who presented to the hospital in extremis. And I'm going to have Dr. Jha kind of go over some of the details of the case and what happened to her. Dr. Jha has written a couple of great pieces that we'll link to later on in the show notes about the case. And he's even recently traveled there for a recent legal proceeding. So he's back from London for about a couple of weeks, and we're going to have him go through this very interesting case and talk about what it says about the various healthcare systems. All right, Dr. Jha, go ahead.
Thanks, Anish and Michelle. Thanks for the invitation. It's a very important case, and thank you for bringing it up today, given that we're going to have a very decisive verdict on Monday. Just to give you a little bit of background, what happened, the clinical side first, and then the legal side a little bit later on. Clinical side is that in 2011, February 2011, a 6-year-old boy, Jack Adcock, came to Leicester Royal Infirmary, referred by his GP for 12-hour history of diarrhea and vomiting. The GP recognized that he was ill, sent him to the Children's Assessment Unit, which is a separate part of the emergency department, where you take referrals from the general practice. And there he was assessed by Dr. Bawa-Garba, who at the time was a pediatric registrar midway through her pediatric training. She had just returned a few weeks earlier from a protracted medical maternity leave. As you know, in Europe, they get long maternity leaves. And it was the first time that she was actually in the Children's Assessment Unit after a long time. So even after the maternity leave, she worked in other wards like oncology, but this was the first time she was actually in the CAU, which is a much more of an undifferentiated situation. So she assessed Jack. In fact, the nurse assessed Jack first, and the nurse said, look, he looks ill. And she assessed Jack instantly, did some blood gases, and given the history of diarrhea and vomiting, her first thought was, right, I think this is viral gastroenteritis, and this is hypovolemic shock from viral gastroenteritis. So the blood gases that she did returned a pH of low pH, 7, so fairly acidotic. And the lactate was also elevated at 11. And she then said, okay, so hypovolemic shock, let's give a fluid bolus, let's maintain the fluid. And Jack had a history of Downs and also a repaired atrioventricular canal defect, for which he was taking maintenance dose of enalapril. He also had some GI issues as well. But that actually made her think, well, let's not go too ballistic with the fluid replacement. In any case, what happened was, after the fluid bolus and the fluid replacement, initially Jack was very ill and didn't even respond to the blood gases being taken. The second time round, when she came back, he was more resistant. He had perked up. He was more colored, more resistant. He had perked up. and the repeat blood gases showed that the pH went from 7 to 7.24. And she said, right, I think I got the diagnosis of gastroenteritis correct. Let's keep a close observation on him, continue with the fluids. And then she had also ordered a chest x-ray. So he came in at 10:25. All of this was done by 11:30. And then she was very busy. She was covering more than what one registrar ought to cover. So she was a registrar, kind of, like fourth, fifth year resident. She had on her service a house officer and a senior house officer, who one PGY1 and PGY2. And this was February. So in England, you have 2 July effects. So, we change jobs twice over there. In August and in February, because there are 6-month posts usually. So it's kind of like, the July effect over here, lots of confusion, lots of how systems are supposed to work. On top of that, the IT system was down. So her team had to physically phone the lab's pathology for results. She was busy. She was being dragged left, right, and center, attending lots of calls, and she at one point she was even doing a lumbar puncture on somebody who had suspected meningitis because no one else in the team knew how to do one. So anyway, Jack perked up. She came back, and around 3 o'clock she looked at the chest X-ray, and I haven't personally seen the chest X-ray, but I can imagine what it was like by the description. They were like fluffy opacities in the right middle lobe, so that kind of viral bronchiolitis versus bacterial pneumonia type of differential. And she'd also taken a CRP, so she'd also said to herself, right, I might need to distinguish between viral and bacterial pneumonia. It's quite, far-sighted, actually, from what I can, because these are not routine tests in England. You don't just send a routine battery of tests. You have to separately order these sort of things. So then she orders she then looks at the chest X-ray and says, right, we're dealing with infection or possible infection, possible bacterial pneumonia. She starts the patient on antibiotics. Jack on antibiotics. Now, there are lots of other things that were going on at the same time. For instance, the nursing staff looking after Jack, some were very experienced, but there was one who wasn't, who was actually an agency nurse. Because, in the NHS, there's a chronic shortage of nurses in acute care. And so this is one of the, so you rely on locums, agencies, moonlighting, and they're not always specialist nurses that you get, because which specialist nurse would be moonlighting if you think about it? It's really general skills that people have when they moonlight. So she had an agency nurse that came in around that was looking after Jack, that probably didn't do the due diligence of monitoring the vital signs. But anyway, I'm not going to shift blame over here. Just try and describe to you the circumstances that were quite understandable from a British NHS hospital point of view. Now, what happened then was that she met her consultant, Dr. Riordan. This was around 4 o'clock. This was during handover. He was away the whole day, and he came around during handover. And she discussed Jack with him and showed him the labs. And she said, look, I've got this guy, this little kid, and we gave the bolus. I started my antibiotics. He's perked up. His pH is better. And the consultants didn't feel the need to go and see Jack, and neither did she feel the need to say that he should, because everything looked to be going in the right direction. And then there were some very strange turns of events. Strange not in terms of kind of mysterious strange, but strange in terms of improbability strange. It was almost like everything kind of lined up at once. So Jack was transferred to the ward, and at the ward, Jack's mother, and there was a policy in Leicester Royal Infirmary that the family can give medication. Jack's mother asked the nurse, should I give Jack, can you give Jack the enalapril? Should I give Jack the enalapril? And the nurse said, well, I can't, because it's not on the drug chart, because Dr. Bawa-Garba purposefully, deliberately took the ACE inhibitor off the drug chart, given the hypovolemic state, given the low pH, and the fact that, it could precipitate more cardiovascular collapse. And then what happened was a little foggy. I don't think anybody really knows, but essentially the nurse asked a junior doctor, not Dr. Bawa-Garba, whether it was okay for the mom to give enalapril, and apparently this person said yes, and later on couldn't recount. But anyway, Jack received enalapril, and you guys are cardiologists. You know what would happen to somebody who is in septic, hypovolemic, or shock that gets enalapril. That's maintaining their blood pressure just by the skin of their teeth, which is what Jack was doing. And an hour later, he went into cardiac arrest, and they were unable to resuscitate him, and he died. So that was how things kind of...
Right. And that's, as far as I understand, the facts are not in dispute, really, the way you've described them. Is that correct? Pretty much they're acknowledged as...
No, the facts are not in dispute. What is in dispute is her culpability at every single point.
Right. So
there is no... Yeah. So
what happened after that? Legal? Can we jump just and then maybe we can go back to the culpability, but just let us know what happened after that? Because I mean, that's, you know, from the way you describe it, it's an unfortunate. It seems to be an unfortunate error. Maybe the care was not stellar. There were clearly a number of what we call system issues and that sort of thing. But then there are some legal proceedings. So what's the first thing that happens?
Yes. So what happened after that? Serious things happened. First, what happened was that anytime a child dies unexpectedly, the police get involved. I mean, they're not looking at judgment issues. They're simply looking at nefarious issues. So the police got involved. And almost instantaneously, what happens is that the case is referred to the coroners. So this was the turning point. When the coroners looked over the case, there was a pediatric expert witness, a pediatric intensivist, who, after some aggressive questioning from the coroner, came to three conclusions, or said three things. The first was that Jack's death was preventable, number one. Number two, that Dr. Bawa-Garba performed subpar. And number three, that her subpar performance contributed to his death. Now, here's a little bit of a snag. In England, you can come up with charges of manslaughter. You don't need intention, and you don't need gross negligence. So, you know, when we think about manslaughter, we think about gross negligence, you know, an opioid-dependent doctor operating. I didn't mean to kill, but my addiction, what can I do? You don't need either of that. All you need to show is going below professional standards. Going far below professional standards, but going below professional standards nonetheless. It doesn't have to be egregious. It doesn't have to be, you know, reckless. It doesn't have to be intentional.
That's very interesting. Do you know if the penalties are lesser, or is it than the ones you would have here for involuntary manslaughter?
I think that the penalty, I mean, I don't know offhand because I haven't looked at all of the cases, but I think the penalties tend to be less severe for physicians, although one doctor who was convicted of manslaughter and later released, later exonerated, Dr. Selu, he actually did spend time in jail.
Okay. So is that a legal category specifically for physicians? Sort of a manslaughter definition as opposed to... I don't think
there's a specific subset for physicians.
Just the term is a little bit, has a lower bar.
Yeah, and it's not the same case in Scotland. It's just very specific to England that you have the situation. So the coroner and the expert witness, when that was made, that's when the Crown Prosecution Service got involved. Now, I actually thought in the beginning that it was Jack Adcock's parents that pursued criminal charges, but I was wrong. I didn't fully understand the system. It was actually the Crown Prosecution Service, and they would have done that regardless of what the parents said. Even if the parents said, "Look, forgive her," if they felt that that there was a case to be made,
if the coroner does this based on an expert witness, based on one expert witness, the coroner can say this was a preventable bad event and therefore criminal. Yes.
Well, I don't think the coroner, it's in the remit of the coroner to say. I mean, in England, there are very, very clear demarcations.
It gets the ball rolling, though. Yeah. I mean, it's not, I don't think the coroner decides, but the coroner gets the ball rolling for an investigation to take place.
So the coroner says it's preventable based on an expert witness, and then the Crown prosecution gets involved.
Yeah, and not just simply the preventable bit. The preventable bit was one element of it. I mean, preventable, as you know, is like this huge bandwidth. Right. It was preventable and the standards fell. So it was the "and" that was important to be here.
So then once the Crown prosecution, once they get once it's a complaint at that level, they must then go to they don't know medicine. They must go to some group of physicians perhaps to decide on that question, or do they just take I mean, how does that happen? Do you know?
Well, this is where it kind of gets a little bit dodgy. So this is not a military court. It's not like a military court where you have a military lawyer, military tribunal. This is a civil court. So you have a jury of 12 people who need not be physicians. In fact, mostly aren't. So in a sense, the criminal court in the UK that does the manslaughter is exactly the same as the civil court in the US that does med-mal. The difference is this. The difference is that when the civil court in the US fines for the plaintiff, we're talking about compensation in dollars. When the criminal court fines against the doctor, we're talking about a criminal charge, possible loss of license, possible time in jail. But the underlying principle is the same, that it's not decided by a jury of peers.
Yeah. Right. I don't want to perseverate on this, but here, if there's a criminal charge that's made, say you walk into a police station and say that we want to make a criminal charge, there's an investigation that then takes place that looks to establish some burden of evidence that says, all right, is this a case that we want to push ahead with? I mean, is there anything here? And then based on that, charges are filed. Then there's a discussion with the prosecutors, and I guess here the Crown Prosecution Service, and the prosecutors then decide whether or not to take the case forward or not. I'm wondering what the bar is to get that ball rolling. Is the bar to get that ball rolling one expert who says this was harm and it was because it was below standard? Is that all it took?
To get the ball rolling, yes, but not to get the full conviction.
Right. Okay.
That was a full-fledged 4.5 week jury trial with a lot of deliberations back and forth.
All right. And so go ahead. So what happened? So what did this jury?
So essentially what happened next, I mean, I think those that have heard the story probably know that that she was convicted of manslaughter, and what's actually happened now isn't to overturn the conviction, but different turn of events. But let's go back to the conviction for manslaughter.
Yeah.
What happened was that the jury found her 10-2 guilty for manslaughter. So the sentencing, or the justice, the judge who presided over the trial, told the jury that if you find that her care for Jack Adcock was truly exceptionally bad, then you find her guilty. So it's kind of these three words ring throughout all of the documents pertaining to her, is the truly exceptionally bad, and they did. And we can talk about that later, I've discussed that in my blog.
It's stunning.
Yeah.
Just stunning. So you're saying that it's not the burden of proof is not reasonable, beyond a reasonable doubt. You're saying 10-2. So there are two people that did not feel that this was.
Yeah, no. I mean, the thing is that there are two issues over here. The first is the burden of proof on whether or not she was truly exceptionally bad, and the second is how many. If one detracts.
Right. You don't need unanimity of the jury.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So you don't need unanimity even in a criminal case I
don't think that this is unique. This element is unique to physicians.
Okay.
I mean, what the troubling bit over here is that it got to the court.
No, that's
once it got to the court, then there's then it's like a Greek tragedy. There's nothing you can do.
No, but I think you're minimizing that side. I mean, do we want to live in a society where we want to keep things out of the court because God knows what the court does? I mean, you're talking about. I mean, what type of court is that? That is a kangaroo court. It's a kangaroo court system that can't actually figure out whether or not somebody is criminally guilty or not. I mean, you want forget if it's physicians related or it's related to medicine or not. You want very high standards before convicting people of criminal offenses. And
I mean, did she have an attorney to defend her? Clearly she was not. I mean, I imagine that she would have an attorney to defending her.
Yeah, she did. She had the one of the medical defense societies. I think it might have been the Medical Protection or Medical Defense Union. I don't know offhand. No, but she did have people defending her. From the description of her mentor, Jonathan Cusack, she was torn apart on the stage. She wasn't very good at defending herself. The cross-examination completely tore her apart. And when I asked him, I said, what exactly? I mean, how exactly did she depart? What were the elements? So they listed multiple elements, like her failure to look at the chest X-ray on time, her failure to tell the mother not to give an Allopril. I mean, that was, how do you know the mother's going to give an Allopril when it wasn't prescribed the drug chart? Her failure not to involve the consultant. So there were lots of those things, but the two things that actually stood out, the thing that they considered egregious failure, was her failure not to appreciate a mildly elevated creatinine and a failure not to appreciate an elevated lactate as being harbingers of red flags for sepsis.
I mean, that to me, that seems plausible, I must say. Look, I'm not a pediatrician, but a kid who presents with a pH of 7 and a lactate of 11 or something like that, right? That's an immediate admission to the intensive care unit. Was there anything preventing her from admitting the I mean, even if she's right, even if the patient, has, or had viral gastroenteritis, I don't know. To me, it seems that a pH of 7 would trigger an immediate admission to the ICU.
Yes, well, that's the thing. That's kind of like a system thing. That's kind of like a protocol thing.
Well, no, would it be? Is it a cultural thing that you don't? I mean, do you think that it's routine in England not to immediately patients?
It's certainly not routine now, but from what I gather, speaking to pediatricians, that managing hypovolemic shock in the children's assessment unit is not, if you believe it is hypovolemic shock, isn't completely out of the ordinary. Now, given what one knows, I'm sure Leicester Royal Infirmary has a policy that anybody that has a pH below this must go to intensive care, must be seen by an intensivist. But at the time, I don't think that her practice was outlandish.
Right. So I think there are two things we ought to discuss. One is assume that she was subpar, and then discuss whether this is a good way of dealing with physicians who are subpar, at least on one occasion. I don't know were there any other charges that she had been subpar, before that, or was there anything else relevant? No, it's primarily just on one occasion. Yeah. So one is, let's assume that she, it was a big mistake, a big mistake not to. No, but I mean, that's one. But number two is, take the opposite side, and let's say, it seems that they were, it doesn't seem egregious. I mean, it's an error, but it doesn't seem at the same time completely egregious. She was not, at least by U.S. standards, she would not meet the criterion of involuntary manslaughter. She's not neglecting the child. She's pursuing the treatment. She's watching after him, right? So there are those, two possible scenarios. But even if we take the worst case scenario of that, it was a gross error, then, how often does that happen? Can you give us a sense of how often do physicians in the NHS get convicted, or at least even tried for manslaughter?
Well, it's still quite infrequent, to be honest, but it's increasing in frequency, and it happens more often than it should. It happens it's one of those kind of rare events that one or two even shakes the system up. But I take your point. Let's start off with the point about her care. Let's say that, firstly, she had an exemplary record before that. She was the top third of her class. And but let's say that her care truly was subpar. The argument made by the General Medical Council, the reason they said that she should not be allowed to practice as a doctor ever again, was that she is not remediable, meaning that she fell so far below standards that she can't be safe. And I think anybody that understands how medicine's practiced, anybody that's seen doctors, knows that every doctor has a moment when they are subpar. Now, if that clashes with another moment, if you kind of have that collision course, then it could be catastrophic for your career and for the patient. But, we all have moments where we're kind of subpar. And the Institute of Medicine, for all their faults in exaggerating the number of medical errors, I give them one thing. At least they said to err is human. I give them respect for that. Now, and now the GMC thinks that there's something irreversible about that. But it's like saying somebody who has a car accident, oh, you're never safe to drive again. Now, that's just plain idiocy.
Right. So briefly for the audience, let's just complete the circle here. So she gets convicted of manslaughter. Then there's a recommendation by the GMC to suspend her license indefinitely. Or,
yes,
an action, not a recommendation, but an action. Or
I'm going to explain the role of the GMC as well in a little bit more detail. But just to complete the loop over here, she gets convicted of manslaughter. She receives a suspended sentence, which basically means that the time of the trial and the custody and all of that is taken into account. Therefore, she is not sent to jail. She then, now what happens, this is around 2015, this is around the end of 2015. The original, the Jack Adcock died in 2011, and she had been practicing intermittently with varying degrees of supervision up till the point that she was found guilty of manslaughter. Now, in 2017, the Medical Practitioners Tribunal met, and thanks largely to the efforts of her mentor, Dr. Jonathan Cusack, who vouched for her clinical competence. They said, look, you messed up, you did fall below standards, it was a bad day, but I think you can be remediated, and you were remediated, and you've proven that you were remediated.
So this tribunal, is that an appeals tribunal that's available to physicians, or? Yeah,
no, so I'll explain the role of the tribunal. It's sort of within the GMC. And so then we're going to suspend you for a year. The GMC were upset with that. They said, no, we want our license to be taken away. So the GMC appealed against the tribunal or to one of the lower division courts, which sided with the GMC. And the appeal hearing that I attended a few weeks ago was of Britain's highest level justices meeting to see whether the lower divisional courts siding with the GMC could be overturned and whether the tribunal struck. So what happened was this about the GMC. So so Britain's most prolific serial killer wasn't Jack the Ripper. It was a general practitioner, Harold Shipman. And years ago, Shipman went around giving people double doses of opioids and lots of people. I mean, some people say that he killed over 200 people.
How many years ago, just roughly? I mean, was it 70s or 80s or?
80s. We're talking about
80s. Okay.
80s, yes, 80s skirting the 90s, something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
So now what happened was that people said, well, how the hell could this happen? How the hell can a doctor do that? Doctors are obviously not self-regulating enough. Now, I mean, if I ever turn out to be a psychopath, and I know Anish thinks that I am, you guys will not know, right? Right? I mean, you will not know what I do in my spare time. How are you going to know what Harold Shipman's getting up to? Because he was a stellar doctor who got brilliant, reviews from his patients. But anyway, in response to that, the GMC were given an extraordinary degree of power in regulating. These doctors have to be looked over. So they developed extraordinary powers as a result of that. And what happened was that there was created within the GMC was an independent body known as the Medical Practitioners Tribunal that comprised doctors, regulators, and lay people that would decide independently of the GMC whether or not somebody was fit to practice. So it's a fitness to practice tribunal. Now, the Medical Practitioners Tribunal, the MPT, theoretically is independent, but as you guys know, there's no true independence, really, is there? I mean, people are always within an earshot of people's opinions. People get influenced by media, etc., etc. Nobody's unbiased. Nevertheless, it's about as unbiased as you can get. And they decided that she should not be struck off, but only be held for a year. And at that point, the GMC literally threw its toys out of the pram and went after its own tribunal.
It's interesting because presumably when you say that the tribunal is independent, it would be independent from the influence of the GMC precisely to be harsher on doctors than than not, right? So it seems that maybe the reverse of what you would expect. Is that correct, or am I misunderstanding?
No, no.
Or does the GMC right now, or since that crazy event from the 1980s, now is on a mission to demonstrate to the public that it is policing the GMC. Everybody belongs to or is it the equivalent of a state board in a state in a U.S. state?
Yeah,
Equivalent of a state board.
I think it's going to be very difficult actually having an exact comparison of a US system.
Does the GMC issue licenses?
They do, yeah. So they are a licensing.
The licensing issuing organization.
And everybody has to contribute to the GMC. Every year the doctors have to pay.
So the doctors pay for the GMC. The GMC is composed of lay people, I suppose, as well as physicians.
GMC is composed of people other than physicians.
Politically appointed?
There are physicians in it.
Appointed by who? Do you know?
The current it's a body that's actually supposed to be answerable to the Parliament. So it's answerable to the people through the Parliament.
Okay, so
so the within the health division of the ministry, you can have appointments for the GMC.
Right.
For example, the current chairman isn't a physician. Is a kind of a white collared regulator that's regulates and has made his career from regulating. So there is a detachment from how clinical medicine works. Now the GMC, I think you mentioned this earlier on, and then GMC, the MPT, the reason for the MPT's independence is that the GMC is a professional regulating body of physicians. So you can't have the judge, jury, and executioner being one, right? It's the who regulates the regulator. It's a step.
Right.
So the GMC, the reason why it got threw its toys out of the pram is because it takes a very uncompromising stance towards this public confidence. It's a nebulous thing, public confidence. Like, you're going to put the physicians in disrepute. If we give her a license, what is the public going to think about the medical profession? I mean, you could make the case that by actually not telling the public how uncertain and foggy clinical medicine is, that's not very good either. That's not very transparent. That's sort of lying as well. But anyway, that's their major rationale. So the GMC basically said, one of the things that they said against the Medical Practitioner Tribunal was that by reinstating her license or giving her license after a year, you're undermining the jury, right? You can't undermine the jury. So this is like a legal, it's like one of those legal caves where you can't go left too much, you can't go right too much, you can't go up, and you can't go down. You got to go into this little narrow passage. So once the jury came out with the manslaughter conviction, even the tribunal said, we sort of agree with the jury. So now you're kind of in this logical blind. Oh, you agree with the jury that this doctor was was convicted of manslaughter, can be practicing medicine safely. So the GMC tried to undo that logical consistency, which is difficult to have. And the Medical Practitioners Tribunal, if you look at what they wrote, they did a very good job of trying to explain why it was okay. They said, okay, you screwed up badly, right?
That's why, this is exactly why, you should never have given up this whole well, in order to gain the trust of the public, we say, yes, this is a screw up, but it's remediable. Because, I don't like that line of reasoning at all, because then it leads you into this logical blind, as you're saying, because then you're stuck saying it was really terrible, something really bad happened because of a bad physician, and now you're stuck. Once you say that, once you accept that, you're stuck with, well, then why should we let this physician practice ever again? If you the desire to not go after the initial horrendous judgment. I mean, there's so many things wrong with this, but we can start with the jury coming to the conclusion that it did, is a big problem. I mean, it's a completely ridiculous decision. I mean, there's no way any physician who knows anything, who sits on some tribunal, I mean, of course, they probably excluded any physicians from the jury, but there's no way that the details of the case make this to be some egregious, ridiculous thing that we should never let people practice again. I mean, the public has no clue what medically egregious is. We have to tell them what's medically egregious. So if you have some aggressive prosecutor that makes poor Hadiza Garba, who I don't know what her proficiency with English is, given that she trained in somewhere else for most of her life.
No, she did her med school in the UK, in Leicester.
Oh, she did. Okay, all right.
Her English is fine. It just wasn't very good at sticking up for herself.
I'm only saying that because I know in cases that I've been involved with that one of the things that lawyers go after in depositions is foreign medical grads with thick, heavy accents who you can't quite understand them, you can make somebody look really, really bad because they get flustered because they don't understand.
No, that is quite true.
They're faced by a bunch of by 12 suits So anyway, my point is that I think we have to. What we as a medical community should tell the public, and we should have been firm on this. And the UK physicians certainly should have been firm on this. Is that the actions that Hadiza took were nowhere close to being egregious. I mean, you can argue about, well, maybe she should have upgraded to the ICU level sooner. But I argue all the time for physician autonomy in terms of making a decision, right? So yes, the pH was 7. Yes, I would absolutely defend a physician that put somebody in the ICU because the pH was 7. But I'd defend a physician that said, all right, here the pH is 7. I'm going to make some type of treatment. I'm going to give volume. And if the kid is on the road to recovery, is getting better, then fine. The patient can go to a tele floor. Go to some type of a monitored floor. Going to a monitored floor, I do this all the time, does not mean that you can't be then upgraded to the ICU from that setting. So, this whole nonsense about the chest X-ray not being read in time, like, give me a break. Like, are you kidding? I mean, we're talking about 2-3 hours that a chest X-ray isn't exactly acted on, and the chest X-ray results aren't screaming, this is lobar pneumonia. This is some non-specific, could be edema, could be pneumonia, and she checked on it, some hours later and gave antibiotics. But if we are to start criminalizing not acting on vague chest X-rays for 3 hours, I mean, we're going to live in an incredibly crazy world.
Yeah, but it's Anish, it's the price doctors pay, and so far actually I'm surprised that they haven't paid that price so highly. But it's the price that they pay for asking the state government to give them a license. If you ask the state to give you a license, you ask it. It comes with the understanding that there has to be some kind of formal process for weeding out the bad apples. And we know that in medicine it's extremely difficult to do, right? Formally, it's extremely difficult to do. But there's a process. There's a process. The steps have been taken, and
well, you can still argue for, I mean, you can still argue for a better process. You can still argue for a bar to criminalize, for a bar to throw somebody out to be not.
Yeah, so I just want to get back to what you said about the tribunal and the logical difficulty there is once somebody is being convicted of manslaughter. So the problem was that once the jury came out with the decision for manslaughter, there's a few things. Firstly, you can't cross-examine the jury. So you can't say to the jury, how the hell did you come up with this decision? That's like the bedrock of law. You can't do that. Second thing is that you cannot have a retrial just because the original trial, you don't like the results of the original trial, or because you thought the defense was shoddy. You can only have a retrial if there is new evidence that wasn't available during the original trial. So incompetence isn't the reason for a retrial. So the only option you have then is swallowing the manslaughter verdict and trying to, navigate yourself out of it. And I fully agree with you that it should never have reached it should never have reached the courts for manslaughter, first and foremost, and secondly, that there has to be a movement that explains to people why what you think are errors and what you think are egregious errors. So, you could call this transparency. And I think one element of transparency, the element that I've certainly been trying to pursue, is to tell people, listen, it's to explain to people something very simple, known as the trade-off between sensitivity and specificity, overcalling and undercalling. And I'll tell you what, I've been doing this for quite a few years, and people still don't get it. And I blame myself. Maybe I'm not explaining it properly. It's hard to explain these concepts to
it's
people.
The accent.
Yeah, all right. I trained in a foreign medical school, right?
No, let me continue to push back, because
very, very difficult to explain these concepts. It's not a position.
Right. Let me push back. Still continue to push back. I think there are many doctors that are really shouldn't be practicing in the system in the U.S. I mean, I think we've all have witnessed them. I mean, perhaps people think that about me. Who knows? But I think there are people who are sort of egregiously, and I'm not saying this, I want to get away from this particular case for a moment, but who are egregiously, malpracticing or being neglectful and really how do you want the system to take care of? For the most part, actually, they come off easy.
Well, but that's like
they have a license. Once they have the license, they just.
Michelle, that's like saying that yes, there are people that commit murder and get away with it. So therefore, we should have a system that convicts innocent people. I mean,
no, it's not the same analogy because well, I'm not sure actually I have a good solution, but this is the question of malpractice is extremely difficult. I'd like to maybe someday we can bring on a legal expert on a legal scholar on medical malpractice, but this idea that the foxes, you can't ask the foxes to I don't know what the saying is, but the foxes and the hen houses, that doctors are going to cover for each other typically, and on the other hand, if you leave it up to the bureaucratic process, which is what happens when you have licensing laws and that sort of thing, then you get these things that seem egregiously unfair, and I don't know what the solution is.
Right. And the thing is that she was the weakest link in all of this. I mean, you've got a trust, you've got a hospital, you've got systems being put in, you've got a consultant that was actually lecturing at a different hospital. In all of this, she's actually one of the weakest links. And so the regulators, the ones that are supposed to
weakest link to come to her self-defense, right?
Weakest link in that particular system. Fault.
Right.
Junior doctors who run the National Health Service are actually the easiest targets of
right. In that sense, correct. In that sense,
and they're actually running the service.
Yeah. So they're actually the strongest. They're actually the fabric that allows the NHS to work. Meaning,
that's right.
You want to spend 8% of your GDP on healthcare and have outcomes that are.
I knew you guys were going to come to that, but look, I think you have a point. I want to say that you're right. They are the prototype.
They're the. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, hospitals in the United States, right? You have attendings on almost all the time, or attendings are 30 minutes. I mean, this poor trainee was covering multiple floors. It sounds like 30, 40 folks, was doing procedures on the floors, was also admitting patients in the ER. I mean, we in the U.S. when U.S. doctors are wine at the highest levels possible, but we would not be able to imagine that. We would never be able to resource our staff hospitals in that way. It's system failure after system failure here, and of course nobody gets indicted. And that's why
for bureaucratic decisions of.
And that's exactly, and that's why it's so ridiculous to me that this happened to somebody who makes up, who is exactly why the NHS works as well as it does. The NHS works as well as it does because it relies on these trainees to be pulling 12. I mean, and this was, by the way, in the middle of the day. This was not at nighttime. In the middle of the day, you have in the NHS, in a busy hospital, you have one trainee that's covering 3 or 4 different services, and that is the person that the system chooses to go after. I mean,
I know. It is absolutely and utterly ridiculous, and the thing is that it's win-win for the British public, because you have fewer consultants, and you have consultants are expensive. They cost. They have a salary. They have a pension, and you have this pyramidal system, like this really steep pyramidal system, where the people running the show are level 2, level 3, level 4 people. And I'll tell you what. So when I was training in surgery, I did emergency medicine for about 6 months, actually more than 6 months, but for 6 months as a senior house officer, and the 2 of us between midnight and 8 running the show in one of London's busiest accident emergencies. And this was not unusual. It wasn't like an unusual hospital. This was the case across most of England. Because there simply weren't enough registrars in emergency medicine at the time. Now there are more registrars, and there are 2 consultants. They could not be on every single night. It would be ridiculous. If they were on every single night, nobody would take the job. It would be a consultant-less consultant app-less job. And so there is definitely underfunding, and this is why I said all along that the solution here, it's not really a solution, but a partial solution, is really to have the junior doctors sign a contract in which they just simply cannot be sued, that all of their mistakes are transferred to the seniors. Because what's going to happen then, as you've read Skin in the Game, is it's going to put the CEO of the trust's skin in the game. It's going to put the consultant's skin in the game. Now the CEO of the trust in February is going to be walking around emergency department saying, hey, listen, have you got enough help? Should I get a locum over here? Oh, why are we short-staffed? We need to have more trainees. You can't be doing the work of all 3 people. Instead, what you have is this Nigerian-born physician who wanted to be a doctor at the age of 13, who, as you know from our type of cultures, Anish, that we tend to be quite deferential. You and I were mutants, but most people in our cultures, we tend to be deferential to authority. We obey. We've been told by our parents that you're so lucky that you're a doctor. You should not rock the boat. And she didn't rock the boat. She got along. She did her exams. She came back. She never complained. Worked extra hours. Took extra shifts. Never picked up on the phone and said, "Hey, this is unsafe practice." She got along with the job. The sort of person you want to have on your team, and they come after her instead. So I think what junior doctors need to do out there is they need to have liability shifted to the CEOs of trusts. And
but Saurabh, that's not going to happen, because it's the bureaucratic logic is that they're always going to shift liability to the doctors, to the fall guy. It's always going. The bureaucracy will never take on the responsibility, and somebody has to be blamed, and it will be the doctor. And the problem is that the junior doctors, they can't. I can't imagine that they will organize themselves, because they're always, transitory. You're a junior doctor for a couple of years. They're transitory, and the lesson here is that what we see in the NHS is happening and will be happening increasingly here. When you work as a doctor for a big system environment, big box medicine and AC, whatever it is, increasingly you're going to be the weak link in the sense that you're going to be the target for the blame for system failures. And I've seen it happen here, and I think it's going to increasingly be happening when we have these big bureaucratic systems that will try to cut corners and will eventually always blame the physicians for their decisions when push comes to shove. And so yeah, go ahead, Anish.
It speaks for, if the system is unable to do something like Saurabh is suggesting, which is, I mean, the system doesn't actually specifically say that here, correct? Meaning the system does not say in the United States that trainees are not responsible, right? But trainees don't carry malpractice insurance. So what happens here in the United States is that, I pay around $50,000 a year for medical malpractice insurance.
Trainees are insured.
Sorry,
in the US.
Sorry, you're right. They are insured, but it's a it's kind of a global fund, right? Meaning my point is that the larger I misspoke. They do have insurance, but their insurance is nothing close to what it is attending physicians have. Meaning like each cardiologist.
Right. Because there is at least in the U.S. system, in that sense, maybe it's from case precedents or whatnot. There's always the assumption that the attending, if you're going to have a case, you're not going to bring it onto the junior. You're going to go after the
right. But I think that's driven. Right, but I think that's driven by the fact that all the money, meaning for the malpractice lawyers to go after, lies with the attending. Meaning each cardiologist is walking around with $3 million that some malpractice attorney can try to get. And that is not the same. That's not anywhere close to
right.
what the trainees are. So,
if you look at 3 different countries, if you look at India, for instance, Britain and the USA, in India, a lot of medical malpractices, they're dealt with by the mob. So the mob literally kicks the crap out of the doctor.
Right. Yes.
In England, it's a step more civilized. It's not the mob, but it's the jail.
Right.
And in the United States, it's money. And no plaintiff lawyer worth his or her grain of salt is going to go after trainee. It's almost going to seem they'd be embarrassed to. They'd be ashamed to. They'd actually make the case that the fault lies with the enterprise. Right. And they will shift the blame onto the enterprise because of the deep pocket.
Right. And I think that's a very good point. That's a very good point, which I think highlights the fact that in general, we should look as physicians here in the United States reasonably favorably on the malpractice system, which is separate from the board sanctions, right? The sanctions from the state board, which is the equivalent of what happened to Bawa-Garba in the US. It's really the UK. The UK does not have a malpractice system whereby patients can bring their grievances separately from the medical boards, and they only have a bureaucratic system, which is really seems to be extremely unfair and extremely bureaucratic, and will not recognize system failures at all. In fact, will tend to shift everything against the doctors. Whereas here, much of the attention is via the malpractice case, where as a doctor you stand a chance, at least some chance to defend yourself. You can hire a big gun.
Right, but to finish my thought, if the system in the UK, which is completely different, which doesn't have the medical malpractice system that we do, if it does not change and does not adjust to give some deference to the reasonable thing that Saurabh is saying here, which is that you should, as a trainee in the UK system, not the fault should never lie with you. The fault should always travel upstream to your supervising, physician, the attending that's of record. If the system does not agree to something like that, then the system should fail. The whole system should fail. We should bring the system down, because that is a stupid system. That
my motto.
Right, exactly. So,
right. Well, I think the system is under strain, and this decision, whatever the decision could be made on Monday, is going to be fairly monumental for the National Health Service.
But sir, why is it that I don't see? I mean, maybe it's because I don't know. Maybe it's because I have blinders on, or I'm not looking in the right places. I don't get the sense that is there a tremendous amount of outrage among UK physicians about this case? I mean, at least on Twitter. I mean, the person who's written about this the most, or written about, given the most attention, given a lot of attention, is you. You're a formerly NHS trained physician training in the US. I've seen a couple blogs, but I don't see it mentioned all the time, honestly.
It is. There is a lot of outrage, extraordinary amount of outrage. In fact, the Crowd Justice did a crowdfunding of her case, appeals case, and they reached their target so quickly that they had to stop taking funds. It is actually creating a lot of anger amongst the junior doctors out there, and even the British Medical Association, an organisation which is usually populated by people that are, career doctor politicians, is actually changing a little bit. I mean, they're having in their councils much more sense of what's going on. So I'm actually quite impressed with them. And there's another organisation whose name I forget. I think it's called the Doctors Association or something like that. It's a new junior doctor organisation which is coming up. So there is an extraordinary amount of outrage. I mean, given the fact that the Brits are usually very understated in whatever they do, you can't get them to actually say anything other than it's not bad. This is quite expressive for that culture. So they are extremely angry, and if if she, you might ask, well, why weren't they angry at the time of the, manslaughter charge? I don't think many people knew. It was when the GMC got her permanently erased or went against the tribunal. That's when, that was like the last straw on the camel's back. That was when people said enough is enough. There's been an editorial in the Lancet against the GMC, prominent members of safety organizations. There's the British Associations of Physicians in Indian Origin. They've campaigned against. I mean, the tide is very much against the GMC on this, and they are totally on the wrong side of history. And I wonder if deep down they're praying that a decision is made against them, because they're kind of in that position where they have to keep appearing to battle, and it would do them immense good if they lost, and if they sacked their current chairman and really sat down and thought how they've been going wrong in their approach to regulating physicians.
Yeah, but the solution, I mean, if we all agree that really a lot of this is because of cutting corners and underfunded hospital, I mean, it's egregious, the underfunding, and it's going to cost. I mean, the NHS is already in deep trouble financially, fiscally, and the real solution is either you start, if you cannot blame the doctors, which we all agree they shouldn't in cases like that. And you can't blame the bureaucrats, because what good does it do to blame the bureaucrats, or sue the bureaucrats, or sue the government, right? Then the only thing you can hope for is that there'll be decent funding, but it's already underfunded and it's already cracking at the seams. They should privatize it, right? The logical solution.
However they get the money, that's so important. I mean, privatization is fine, third-party insurance is fine, but 9% of the GDP isn't. And the problem that they've run into is that there's so much self-congratulation that the Commonwealth Fund, that idiotic think tank over here, doesn't help matters by coming up with silly rating schemes about international comparisons. What they need to do is they have to realize that in the modern healthcare system that people expect, 9% of the GDP is not going to cut it. So let me give you an example. Over here, when we suspect infection, or the ED suspects infection, pneumonia, for instance, we have to read the chest X-ray in 30 minutes. 30 minutes. How do you think we read the chest X-ray in 30 minutes? Because there are radiologists left, right, and center. Right? I'm the one in the center, but left and right. How are there so many radiologists? Does anyone pause to think? Because there's money. Why is there so much money? Because there's lots of imaging. Why is there lots of imaging? Because you have a system that does that. So the point is that if you want that type of American-style chest X-ray within 30 minutes, you're not going to get that. And we have to phone them up if there is actually pneumonia. You're not going to get that if you have one radiologist out there cranking studies, totally morale depleted, going home at 6 p.m. It doesn't work. And this hyper-efficiency thing, which is sort of what Atul Gawande was pushing with his Cheesecake Factory, doesn't work with physicians.
Saurabh, all your friends in the Less is More movement are listening to this and thinking that maybe you've really gone psychopathic.
Well, I'm being honest with you. Look, I am perfectly willing to accept that. I'm perfectly willing to say that the NHS is phenomenal with thrift, but it comes at a consequence. I think people should accept the consequence and should realize that there's a lot of things the NHS does very well. For example, it manages myocardial infarction very well, STEMIs very well. It manages trauma pretty well. It manages acute abdomens very well. It just doesn't do very well with outliers. And so if you want to chase outliers, you need to have a system that's twice as large as what you have right now. It's not a linear thing. It's an exponential thing, because outliers by definition are very rare. So I'm perfectly happy. I mean, if I were the Tsar, I'd say to the British people that be content with the 9% GDP. Use your money to go to south of Spain and enjoy yourself, but be aware that you will be in a system which is going to be underfunded, run by junior doctors, where mistakes can happen. But if you say that, people say, oh, no, we do this very well, we do that very well. We can't have it both ways, mate. We can't have it both ways. Which one is it? Are you totally good, well-funded? Then stop complaining about the NHS. If you're underfunded, either say that this is fine or...
Right. Well, you actually can have it both ways. If people listen to me, Because in a free market, you would have systems where if you want to go, if you want a system that goes after all the outliers and you take very little risk and whatnot, it costs a little more. And if you want something bare bone and pay little, it costs less. And you'll have both of them coexisting, right? You'll have the whole gamut of services. You'll have, the cheapo, where you accept the risks that you take for paying less. And then you'll have the other ones. But anyway, should we wrap up? I mean, it's been anything else? Any final thoughts?
No. So just to briefly recap where we are now, and maybe we'll have you back on to talk about what the eventual outcome of this is. You had Bawa-Garba, who was a pediatrician who was taking care of a sick child. The child did not do well, and actually, died. And ultimately, you had the criminal justice system involved, which actually convicted her for manslaughter. The medical tribunal subsequently, the medical practice tribunal that's under the GMC, the General Medical Council in the UK, which is a licensing organization, then said that she should not be stripped of being allowed to practice, and instead should be a suspension. And then the GMC came down and said that no, that's not that we don't, that you can't countermand the jury. And now there's an appeals process, and that's the trial, or that's the appeal process that you were at recently. That's appealing that decision to allow to see whether or not she can practice again or not. Is that correct?
That's correct. Essentially, it's between the tribunal and the GMC.
Okay.
If the justices stick to the tribunal, she's going to be a pediatrician again.
Okay.
If the justices stick to the GMC, she will never be a doctor.
But materially, it doesn't change much. This particular decision doesn't change much to the situation for the average doctor in the UK, especially the junior doctors or people who are working in high-risk areas, right? Because regardless of how the final decision comes here, they're still at risk for being the fall
scapegoat
guy or the scapegoat for system errors.
There is still risk, but the one thing that will come from it is that the GMC have been going after the tribunal quite a bit. Whenever they disagree with the tribunal, they've been appealing against the decisions, which really kind of defeats the purpose of having the tribunal. If it's like me asking you for your opinion, right, and then if I don't like it, I'm saying, well, I don't want to hear your opinion.
I think this whole thing has exposed regardless of what the decision is, I hope for Hadiza's case, Bawa-Garba's case, that they allow her to practice again. I mean, I think the whole thing is a massive miscarriage of justice against her. And I mean, in here she would have 5 lawyers that were suing the UK for taking away her right to practice for millions of dollars. But regardless of what happens, this kind of exposes a degree of rot. It's like there's a rotting corpse. And if the jury does, if this current appeals process goes the right way, it's like spraying some air freshener to make it smell better. But there's still a rotting corpse that nobody's doing anything about. And so I hope that folks in the UK aren't complacent about what actually is going on. I mean, and I think unless there's something systematic like what you're talking about, trainees being absolved from any criminality if things go wrong. I don't think you've really fixed anything, like Michelle is saying. So
no, absolutely, and I think that they have to go, regardless of the verdict. We will cross our fingers and make sure that things turn out well for Dr. Bawa-Garba. But regardless of the verdict, they have to be relentless. Yeah. They need to go to Parliament. They need to actually bring it up with the highest authority. And things are very slow in England. There is a process.
Oh, I meant to ask this and I forgot. Here, the president can pardon anyone he wants. I can't imagine. I mean, can the Queen not, with a wave of her sword that she used for knighting people, can she not pardon anyone she wants?
So the Queen has the same power as Mr. Trump. You'd be pleased to know.
Yes,
she can pardon. She can surely pardon. I think I've said this before. It may require a royal pardon to kind of reboot the National Health Service. It would be one good thing that she can.
Feudalism will come to the rescue. Yes, let us hope.
Let's hope so. It will be tremendous irony.
All right. Well, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Yep. Thanks. Wonderful.